Echoing through the grand ballroom, the Duke's cold laughter mocked the jagged, calloused scars of a common mill worker. The elite crowd saw nothing but her burns. Yet, the moment those ruined fingers struck the first explosive chord of Chopin's Winter Wind, the mockery died in their throats. What followed was a performance that permanently altered history. The year was 1851, and the air in London was thick with the smog of industry and the frantic, glittering anticipation of the Great Exhibition. Inside the grand townhouses of Mayfair, aristocrats debated the architectural merits of Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, while in the shadowed, soot-stained alleys of the East End, the working class bled to build their empire. Genevieve Cade knew both worlds intimately. She possessed the rare, tragic distinction of having fallen from the former straight into the unforgiving maw of the latter. 4 years prior, Genevieve had been the darling of the London season. The daughter of Thomas Cade, a wildly successful merchant who imported fine silks from the Orient, she had wanted for nothing. Her days were spent in a sunlit drawing room in Kensington, her delicate, pale fingers dancing across the ivory keys of a custom-crafted broadwood grand piano. She had been taught by an aging protege of Ignaz Moscheles, who had wept upon hearing her interpretation of Beethoven. She had possessed a gift, a profound, almost supernatural ability to channel human emotion through wood and wire. Then came the railway panic of 1847. Thomas Cade, blinded by the promise of exponential wealth, had invested his entire fortune and leveraged his home into the ill-fated Grand Eastern Railway expansion. When the bubble burst, it did not merely pop, it detonated, leaving a crater that swallowed the Cade family whole. Thomas suffered a fatal apoplexy the day the bailiffs arrived to seize the Broadwood piano. Genevieve, at 18, was left orphaned, utterly penniless, and burdened with a mountain of her father's remaining debts. Society turned its back with the swift, synchronized precision of a flock of birds altering its course. The suitors vanished. The invitations ceased. Desperate to survive and pay off the creditors who threatened her with the debtor's prison, Genevieve sought employment in the only place that did not ask for references, the Spitalfield silk mills. For 3 years, the girl who had once played Chopin in silk gowns labored 14 hours a day in a deafening, suffocating factory. The mechanical looms were monstrous beasts of iron and wood, demanding constant, dangerous attention. Genevieve's job was to clear jams and rethread the bobbins while the machinery was still moving, a terrifying dance of precision. It was during the brutal winter of 1849 that the accident occurred. Exhausted, shivering, and half-starved, Genevieve's timing faltered by a fraction of a second. The heavy iron shuttle of the loom slammed into her left hand, pinning it against the abrasive wooden frame. The gears tore through her flesh, crushing her left pinky and laying her palms open to the coarse, dyed threads. The physical pain was agonizing, but the spiritual death was absolute. As she sat in the filthy infirmary, a gruff apothecary roughly stitching her mangled fingers together, Genevieve stared at her ruined hands. The skin was scarred, cross-hatched, with deep, white lines. The knuckles were thickened, the tips calloused into hard leather. Her left pinky healed slightly crooked, bearing a jagged burn scar from the friction of the moving threads. They were the hands of a dock worker, a laborer, a scullery maid. They were no longer the hands of a musician. In that grim infirmary, listening to the relentless rhythmic thud of the looms, Genevieve buried her soul. Salvation, of a cruel and humiliating sort, arrived 2 years later in the form of her estranged aunt, Lady Agatha Linfield. Having finally grown weary of the societal gossip regarding her poor, destitute niece rotting in the East End, Lady Agatha offered Genevieve a position as a lady's companion to her daughter, Rosalind. Genevieve accepted. She had no choice. Her lungs were beginning to fail from the cotton dust. She traded the deafening roar of the mill for the suffocating, silent cruelty of her aunt's household. Rosalind was a striking beauty of 20, utterly devoid of intellect, empathy, or talent. Her sole ambition was to marry higher than a viscount. To achieve this, she required a constant, pliant shadow, someone to carry her shawls, mend her hymns, and endure her endless, petty tyrannies. Genevieve, with her ruined hands hidden beneath cheap cotton gloves, played the part perfectly. She kept her eyes downcast, her voice soft, and locked the memory of music into the darkest corner of her mind. But music is a living thing. It cannot be starved. At night, when the Linfield household slept, Genevieve would creep down to the disused servants' parlor. There, tucked under a dusty sheet, sat a broken, out-of-tune spinet. It was a pathetic instrument, missing several strings and smelling of damp wood. Genevieve would sit before it, remove her gloves, and stare at her scarred hands. At first, she could not bear to touch the keys. The pain in her joints was sharp, a lingering reminder of the loom. But slowly, desperately, she began to press the ivory. She had to modify her fingerings to accommodate her stiffened pinky. She had to build new calluses to cushion the strike. She practiced in near silence, playing the complex fugues of Bach and the fiery etudes of Liszt, pushing her ruined hands beyond their physical limits. She played until her scars ached, until tears blurred her vision, fueled by a mixture of grief, rage, and a defiant, unkillable love for the art. She knew no one would ever hear her. She was a ghost playing for the shadows. Until the invitation arrived from the Duke of Westmoreland. Gareth Pendleton, the Duke of Westmoreland, was a man who possessed too much wealth, too much influence, and far too little patience for mediocrity. At 32, he was a dominant force in British politics and a close personal friend of Prince Albert. More importantly, he was the nation's foremost patron of the arts. It was widely known that an endorsement from the Duke could elevate an artist to international stardom, while his disapproval could end a career before it began. The Duke was currently obsessed with a singular mission tasked to him by the Prince Consort himself, to discover an exceptional, homegrown musical talent to perform at the grand opening of the Great Exhibition. He sought a pianist whose skill could rival the virtuosos of Europe, someone who could match the fire of the young Clara Schumann or the theatrical brilliance of Franz Liszt, who had recently toured the continent to rapturous applause. To find this prodigy, the Duke hosted exclusive weekend soirees at his sprawling country estate, Blackwood Manor. He despised the name of the estate, considering it entirely too Gothic, but it was ancestral. The invitations were highly coveted, functioning as high-stakes auditions for the aristocracy's most ambitious musicians. When Rosalind Linfield received an invitation, the household was thrown into a frenzy. Rosalind fancied herself a master of the pianoforte, though her playing was, in reality, mechanically rigid and aggressively loud. She demanded that Genevieve accompany her, insisting she needed her drudge to manage her extensive wardrobe and turn her sheet music. The journey to the Duke's estate took 3 days by carriage. Genevieve sat in the cramped corner, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the rolling green hills of the English countryside pass by. She felt a strange, hollow detachment. She was merely a prop, a piece of worn luggage dragged along for the comfort of her wealthy cousin. Upon arriving, they were thrust into a world of unimaginable opulence. The Duke's estate was a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, filled with Renaissance portraits, roaring fireplaces, and the scent of expensive beeswax and imported orchids. The guests were the absolute elite of British society, lords, ladies, ambassadors, and acclaimed critics. And then there was the Duke. Gareth Pendleton was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing slate-gray eyes and a sharp aristocratic jawline. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He did not suffer fools, and his tongue was notoriously lethal. During the first evening's dinner, Genevieve observed him from her relegated seat at the far end of the companions' table. She watched as he systematically dismantled a member of Parliament's argument regarding trade tariffs, his tone perfectly polite, yet devastatingly sharp. He looked bored, restless, and deeply cynical. The true trial began after dinner, in the grand music room. The room was breathtaking, designed specifically for acoustics, with vaulted ceilings painted with frescoes of Apollo and the Muses. In the center of the room, positioned like a sacrificial altar, sat the Duke's prized possession, a magnificent, custom-built Erard grand piano, imported directly from Paris. Its polished mahogany surface gleamed under the light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering, capable of thundering resonance and whisper-soft delicacy. Genevieve's breath hitched at the sight of it. Her fingers twitched inside her cotton gloves. The auditions commenced. One by one, the aristocratic hopefuls took their turns at the Erard. The Duke sat in a high-backed velvet armchair near the front, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression a mask of polite indifference. It was a parade of mediocrity. Lord Hastings butchered a delicate Mozart sonata, treating the keys as if they owed him money. Lady Beatrice performed a popular drawing-room ballad that was so overwhelmingly saccharine the Duke was seen rubbing his temples in physical pain. Finally, it was Rosalind's turn. She swept toward the piano in a rustling cloud of crimson silk, practically vibrating with self-importance. She signaled for Genevieve to follow. Genevieve stepped out of the shadows, keeping her head lowered. She took her place slightly behind the piano bench, ready to turn the pages of the score. Rosalind had chosen a notoriously difficult piece, a transcription of Schubert by Liszt. It was a terrible mistake. From the very first measure, it was apparent that she lacked both the technical dexterity and the emotional depth required. She played the notes, but they were devoid of phrasing, dynamics, or soul. It was a robotic, clunky performance that murdered the rhythm and ignored the pedal marks. Genevieve stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the sheet music, but inside she was screaming. Every missed accidental, every rush tempo felt like a physical blow. She could see the Duke from the corner of her eye. He had leaned forward, his knuckles white around his brandy glass, his jaw clenched in obvious irritation. When Rosalind finally struck the final, agonizingly flat chord, a smattering of polite, obligatory applause rippled through the room. She stood, flushing with pride, and curtsied deeply to the Duke. The Duke did not applaud. He took a slow sip of his brandy, set the glass down on a side table, and stood up. The room instantly fell into a breathless silence. "Lady Rosalind," the Duke began, his voice a low, carrying baritone that dripped with dangerous civility. That was a remarkable display of physical stamina. Rosalind's smile faltered. "Your Grace, I am astounded," he continued, taking a step toward the piano, "that one could strike so many notes in such rapid succession and yet convey absolutely nothing of the composer's intent. You have treated this magnificent Erard not as an instrument of art, but as an anvil upon which to hammer your vanity." A collective gasp echoed from the audience. Rosalind turned stark white, her eyes welling with tears of profound humiliation. I assure your Grace, my instructor, your instructor is a thief who has robbed you of your time, and your father of his coin," the Duke interrupted ruthlessly. He stepped closer, his imposing presence towering over Rosalind. "This instrument requires a soul to sing. You have given it only noise." Desperate to escape his piercing gaze, Rosalind turned sharply, her heavy silk skirt catching on the leg of Genevieve's chair. She stumbled, falling against Genevieve. Caught off guard, Genevieve reached out to steady her cousin. As she did, her cheap cotton glove caught on the intricate brass hinge of the piano's music desk. The fragile fabric tore completely, ripping down the seam and exposing Genevieve's bare left hand to the entire room. The Duke, standing mere feet away, froze. His eyes dropped from Rosalind's tear-stained face to Genevieve's exposed hand resting against the mahogany. In the brilliant, unforgiving light of the chandeliers, her scars were on full display. The thick, jagged white lines crisscrossing her palm. The crushed, slightly bent pinky finger. The heavy, yellowed calluses on her fingertips, born of brutal, relentless friction against iron and thread. It was a hand that told a story of violence, poverty, and grueling, unglamorous labor. It was a grotesque anomaly in this room of manicured perfection. The silence in the music room grew absolute. Every eye was fixed on the disfigured hand of the servant girl. The Duke's expression morphed from irritation to an icy, mocking incredulity. He looked at Genevieve, really looked at her, noting her plain, drab dress and her lowered gaze. "Good God!" the Duke murmured, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. He let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound of genuine, dismissive disbelief. He turned his gaze back to Rosalind. "Lady Rosalind, I was unaware you employed farriers in your personal retinue, or perhaps she is a stonemason." A few cruel titters erupted from the aristocratic crowd. Rosalind, seizing the opportunity to deflect her own humiliation, sneered at her cousin. "She is my destitute cousin, your Grace, Genevieve. She spent years working in the Spitalfields mills before we took pity on her. She is quite clumsy." "I can see that," the Duke said coldly. He stepped forward, leaning in slightly toward Genevieve, his gray eyes locking onto her downcast face. "Keep your servant away from the keys, Lady Rosalind. I fear those ruined butcher's hands might scratch the ivory. One must possess refinement to touch such an instrument. Art requires delicacy, not brute force." He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence entirely. "Next, please," he called out to the room, "and let us pray they have washed their hands." The laughter of the aristocracy is a distinct sound. It is not joyous, it is a collective, sharp exhalation of superiority. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings, washing over Genevieve in cold, stinging waves. For 4 years, Genevieve had swallowed her pride. She had endured the deafening roar of the mills, the agonizing destruction of her flesh, the agonizing hunger, and the daily, insidious humiliations inflicted by her aunt and cousin. She had accepted her fall from grace. She had accepted her invisibility. But as she stood there, looking down at her exposed, scarred hand resting against the pristine edge of the Erard piano, something within her snapped. It was not a loud, explosive breaking. It was the quiet, terrifying fracture of a dam that could no longer hold back the sea. The Duke had not just insulted her poverty, he had insulted her hands. The hands that had bled to keep her father out of a pauper's grave. The hands that had fought in the dead of night on a broken spinet to keep the music alive. He had looked at the physical manifestation of her survival and called it ugly. He had told her she was unworthy of the art that belonged to her soul. Genevieve slowly reached over with her right hand and peeled off her remaining glove. She let the cheap cotton fall to the polished wooden floor. Rosalind, noticing the movement, hissed under her breath. "Genevieve, what are you doing? Pick that up and get out of sight. You've embarrassed me enough." Genevieve did not look at her cousin. She did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on the gleaming ivory keys. Instead of stepping back into the shadows, Genevieve stepped forward. She moved with a sudden, startling grace, brushing past the sputtering Rosalind, and seated herself squarely on the plush velvet piano bench. A shocked collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The murmurs erupted into outraged whispers. "What is the creature doing? Someone remove the servant. Is she mad?" The Duke, who had been halfway back to his armchair, spun around. His eyes widened in genuine shock, his aristocratic composure cracking for the first time. The insolence was unfathomable. A ruined mill worker, seating herself at his Erard, uninvited, in the middle of a royal audition. "You there," the Duke barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "Get up from that bench immediately. Guards, remove this girl." Genevieve ignored him. She raised her hands, her scarred, calloused, ugly hands, and hovered them over the keys. She closed her eyes. The room, the Duke, the whispering aristocrats, the pain in her crooked finger, it all faded away. There was only the wood, the wire, and the storm raging inside her chest. She did not choose a delicate Mozart sonata. She did not choose a polite drawing-room ballad. She chose the piece she had practiced in the freezing dark until her fingers bled. She chose a piece of such terrifying difficulty and emotional violence that few male virtuosos dared to attempt it in public. She chose Chopin's Etude Op. 25, No. 11 inches, A minor, The Winter Wind. Genevieve brought her hands down. The opening consisted of 4 measures of a slow, ominous martial march in the right hand. It was deceptively quiet. Dum, dum, dum. The notes rang out from the Erard with a crystalline, haunting clarity. The Duke stopped in his tracks, just 3 feet from the piano. The guards, who had stepped forward at his command, hesitated. The absolute authoritative precision of those first 4 notes was shocking. It was the touch of a master. Then the storm broke. Genevieve's right hand plunged into the descent of the first cascade, a relentless, terrifyingly fast torrent of sweeping arpeggios and chromatic runs. Simultaneously, her left hand, the crushed, scarred left hand, pounded out the booming, relentless march theme in the bass. The sound that exploded from the Erard was apocalyptic. It did not sound like a piano. It sounded like a force of nature breaking through the walls of the manor. The Duke physically recoiled, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. Genevieve's hands flew across the keyboard with a feral, devastating speed. The thick calluses on her fingertips, rather than dulling the sound, struck the ivory with the force of ball-peen hammers, producing a tone of immense ringing volume that a softer hand could never achieve. Her ruined left pinky, stiff and unbending, struck the bass octaves with the thunderous power of a cannon shot. She played with an aggression and a raw, bleeding passion that ripped the polite veneer off the room. This was not music for a drawing room. This was the sound of a woman screaming at God. It was the sound of the iron looms crushing bone. It was the sound of starvation, of freezing winters, of absolute, soul-crushing grief. The aristocracy sat frozen, practically pinned to their velvet chairs by the sheer wall of sound. Lord Hastings dropped his monocle. Lady Beatrice sat with her mouth slightly open, all color drained from her face. Rosalind was shaking, staring at her drudge, as if she had suddenly transformed into a demon. The Duke stood paralyzed. His slate-gray eyes were locked onto Genevieve's hands. He watched the agonizing stretch of her scarred fingers, the tendons standing out sharply against her pale skin. He watched the blood rush to her knuckles. He saw the slight wince of physical pain that crossed her face as she forced her healed bones to reach a devastating 10th interval, but she did not falter. She pushed harder. He had spent years searching for a musician who possessed the elusive fire. He had traveled to Vienna, to Paris, listening to polished prodigies who played with perfect, soulless mathematics. Now, standing in his own music room, a destitute mill worker with the hands of a butcher was tearing the very fabric of the music apart, playing with a level of genius that bordered on the terrifying. As the etude reached its furious, swirling climax, Genevieve leaned into the piano, her entire body channeling the final massive chords. Her hands struck the keyboard with a final echoing crash that seemed to shake the crystal in the chandeliers above. She held the final chord, letting the immense resonance of the Erard ring out, vibrating through the floorboards and into the bones of every person in the room. Then she lifted her hands. She lowered them slowly to her lap, her chest heaving, a single drop of sweat tracing a line down her pale cheek. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of an audience waiting to applaud. It was the profound, deafening silence of a room that has just witnessed a miracle. No one moved. No one breathed. Genevieve did not look at the Duke. She slowly stood up, stepped around the bench, bent down to retrieve her torn cotton gloves from the floor, and began to walk quietly toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. Genevieve's footsteps were nearly silent against the Persian runners of the grand corridor, but to her own ears, her heartbeat was deafening. She had committed social suicide. By the rigid, unforgiving laws of her era, a servant striking a noble's instrument uninvited was grounds for immediate dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. Yet, as she clutched her torn cotton gloves, she felt no terror. For the first time in 4 years, her chest was light. The phantom weight of the iron looms had vanished. She had spoken the only language she had ever truly known, and she had screamed it into the faces of the people who had erased her. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the music room burst open with a violent crash. "Genevieve!" The voice was a booming command that demanded the obedience of armies. Genevieve did not stop. She quickened her pace toward the servants' stairwell, desperate to pack her meager belongings and vanish into the night before Lady Agatha could have her arrested. "Miss Cade, halt at once." The use of her surname, her true buried surname, made her freeze. Before she could turn, heavy, urgent footsteps closed the distance between them. A large, warm hand clamped gently but firmly around her wrist, turning her around. Duke Gareth Pendleton stood before her, his chest heaving, his immaculate cravat slightly askew. The icy, untouchable aristocrat was gone. In his place was a man violently unspooled. His slate-gray eyes were wide, scanning her face as if searching for a ghost. "Who taught you?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper. "To play with such terrifying violence. Who gave you that phrasing?" Genevieve lifted her chin, her pride reignited by the lingering adrenaline. "A man named Henri Lafargue. He was a pupil of Ignaz Moscheles. The Duke inhaled sharply, stepping closer. Lafargue. I knew of him. He died in the cholera outbreak of 48. He only took on one prodigy in his final years. The daughter of the silk merchant, Thomas Cade. His eyes darted down to her ruined left hand, which she instinctively tried to pull away. He did not let go. His thumb lightly, almost reverently, brushed the thickened scar tissue on her knuckles. The merchant, who was ruined by George Hudson, the railway king, and his fraudulent expansions. Genevieve flinched at the mention of the man who had destroyed her family. You are well informed, Your Grace. I am informed because my own financial advisors warned me against Hudson's schemes just weeks before the bubble burst, the Duke confessed, his voice laced with a sudden heavy guilt. I pulled my capital out. Your father did not. He looked back up into her eyes, and Genevieve was stunned to see something glistening in the Duke's piercing gaze. It was profound, gut-wrenching remorse. I called your hands the hands of a butcher, he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I looked at the physical map of your survival, of your agonizing sacrifice, and I mocked it to entertain a roomful of sycophants. I have never been more deeply ashamed of my own arrogance. Before Genevieve could process this impossible apology, the corridor was flooded with the rustling of angry silk. Lady Agatha and Rosalind came storming out of the music room, flanked by 2 footmen. Your Grace, Lady Agatha shrilled, her face purple with aristocratic rage. I beg your deepest pardons for this wild, feral creature. I assure you, she will be whipped for her insolence and thrown out onto the streets this very night. Guards, seize her. Touch her, the Duke growled, releasing Genevieve's wrist and pivoting to face the footman with the lethal grace of a cornered lion, and I will have you both clapped in irons and shipped to the penal colonies in Van Diemen's Land. The footman froze instantly. Lady Agatha physically recoiled, clutching her chest. Your Grace? Lady Agatha, Gareth's voice was pure, cutting ice. You took in a prodigy, a girl of profound genius, and you made her carry your vain, talentless daughter's sheet music. You allowed a woman who can play the winter wind with the force of a tempest to sew your hems with hands broken by a cotton mill. He stepped toward them, his towering height deeply intimidating. You are no longer welcome on my estate. You will pack your belongings and depart before dawn. If I hear a single whisper of slander against Miss Cade in London, I will use every ounce of my influence in Parliament to ruin your family's name so thoroughly that your descendants will beg for coppers in the street. Do I make myself perfectly clear? Rosalind burst into hysterical tears. Lady Agatha, shaking like a leaf, grabbed her daughter's arm and fled down the corridor. The Duke turned back to Genevieve. The fury in his eyes melted into a fierce, burning determination. Miss Cade, he said, his tone shifting into one of absolute business, though his chest still rose and fell rapidly. Prince Albert tasked me with finding a symbol of British exceptionalism for the opening of the Great Exhibition. He did not want a polished, pampered aristocrat playing polite melodies. He wanted raw power. He wanted a story of iron, industry, and the unconquerable human spirit. You are not just the musician he is looking for. You are the embodiment of this new age. Genevieve stared at him, her mind reeling. You want me to perform at the Crystal Palace? Your Grace, look at my hands. Society will not accept a pianist who looks like a dock worker. To hell with society, Gareth said fiercely. He reached out and took both of her hands in his, holding the calloused, scarred flesh against his immaculate velvet coat. They will hear you, they will weep, and they will bow. Play for the exhibition, Genevieve. I will clear every remaining penny of your father's debt by morning. I will buy back your family's Kensington home, and I will stand by your side against anyone who dares to whisper a word against you. Genevieve looked at the man who, just an hour ago, had been her cruelest tormentor. She saw the fiery challenge in his eyes, but beneath it, she saw a man who had finally found the music his soul had been starving for. Slowly, her fingers curled, gripping his warm hands back. You will need to have the piano tuned frequently, Your Grace, she warned softly. I strike the keys rather hard. The Duke let out a breath that sounded like a laugh of pure relief. I will buy you 100 pianos, Genevieve. Break them all. May 1, 1851. London had never seen anything like the Crystal Palace. Rising from the green expanse of Hyde Park, Joseph Paxton's masterpiece of cast iron and plate glass glittered like a massive diamond under the spring sun. Over 100,000 people crowded the park, waiting for the arrival of Queen Victoria. Inside, the massive structure housed the wonders of the modern world. Massive steam engines, exotic textiles from India, and the most spectacular feats of human engineering. In a private antechamber draped in red velvet, just behind the grand central stage, Genevieve stood entirely still. She was no longer the dusty, invisible drudge of Spitalfields. The Duke had summoned the finest dressmakers in London. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the vibrant green of her eyes, completely devoid of the fussy lace and ruffles favored by the aristocracy. It was sleek, modern, and powerful. But the most striking detail was what she was not wearing. "Are you certain about this?" Gareth stepped into the room, looking resplendent in his formal military dress uniform. He approached her, his eyes falling to her bare hands, resting against her emerald skirt. "The Queen's equerry suggested white silk gloves," Gareth murmured, stopping just inches from her. "Cut at the fingertips, so you might play, but hide the history." "No," Genevieve said firmly. She held up her hands. The thick, white scars stood out starkly against her pale skin. Her crooked left pinky remained a testament to the iron gears. "If I hide them, I am pretending to be one of them. I am not. Every callus on my fingers bought my survival. I will not apologize for them. I will not hide them from the Queen, nor from the world." Gareth's gaze softened with a profound, overwhelming affection. Over the past 3 months of relentless rehearsals, the transactional nature of their arrangement had entirely dissolved. They had spent hours in the music room at Westmoreland House, arguing over tempo, debating Beethoven, and slowly, inextricably, falling in love. He had watched her play until she collapsed, driven by a ghost he could finally understand. She had seen the lonely, deeply passionate man hiding beneath the cynical armor of a duke. "You are the bravest creature I have ever known," Gareth whispered. He reached out, took her scarred left hand, and brought it to his lips. He pressed a warm, lingering kiss directly against the jagged burn on her palm. Genevieve's breath hitched, a flush rising to her cheeks. "Play for them, my lioness. Tear the glass from the roof." Trumpets blared from the main hall. A booming voice announced the arrival of Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, and His Royal Highness, Prince Albert. The time had come. Genevieve walked out of the velvet drapes and onto the massive stage. The scale of the audience was terrifying. Tens of thousands of faces looked up at her. The elite of Europe, foreign dignitaries, acclaimed authors like Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray, and at the very front, seated on a raised dais, the Queen herself. In the center of the stage sat a colossal, custom-built Broadwood grand piano, a gift from the Duke. Genevieve sat at the bench. A murmur rippled through the front rows as the aristocrats raised their opera glasses. They saw the bare hands. They saw the scars. A wave of shocked whispering began to build, a rising tide of aristocratic judgment. Genevieve closed her eyes. She thought of her father. She thought of the deafening roar of the Spitalfields looms. And she thought of Gareth, standing in the wings, believing in her when the entire world had thrown her away. She raised her hands. The whispering continued. And then she brought her hands down, unleashing the opening chords of Beethoven's Piano Concerto, number 5 inches, E-flat major, The Emperor. The sheer, explosive power of the first chord struck the massive glass hall like a physical shockwave. The whispering died instantly. Genevieve played like a woman possessed by the gods. The Emperor Concerto was a piece of triumphant martial brilliance, demanding immense physical stamina and emotional grandeur. Her scarred fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed, her heavy calluses allowing her to strike the keys with a brilliant bell-like clarity that pierced through the vast acoustics of the Crystal Palace. She did not play with the polite, restrained elegance expected of a lady. She played with the furious, unstoppable energy of a steam engine. She played with the fire of the industrial age. The music roared, soared, and wept. During the delicate, heartbreakingly beautiful second movement, Her touch was so profoundly tender that Queen Victoria was seen pressing a lace handkerchief to her eyes. But it was the final movement, the triumphant, galloping rondo, where Genevieve truly conquered the world. Her hands, those ruined, ugly hands, blurred over the ivory, summoning a tempest of joy and victory. As she struck the final, monumental chords, she stood up from the bench, letting the thunderous resonance fill the crystal dome. For a terrifying 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, Queen Victoria stood up. The monarch began to applaud. Prince Albert followed. Within seconds, the entire Crystal Palace erupted into a deafening, earth-shaking roar. Men threw their top hats into the air. Women openly wept. The applause was a physical wall of sound, 1,000 times louder than the looms of Spitalfields, but this time it was a sound of salvation. Genevieve stood center stage, tears streaming down her face, bowing deeply. When she rose, she looked to the wings. Gareth was standing there, ignoring all protocol. He walked directly onto the stage, in front of the Queen, the Prince, and the thousands of screaming spectators. He didn't care. He reached Genevieve, took her scarred face in his hands, and kissed her. The crowd, fueled by the intoxicating romance of the moment, screamed even louder. When Gareth finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily, anchored in the center of the roaring storm. "They loved you," he said, a fierce smile breaking across his handsome face. "The world is yours, Genevieve." "No," she replied, lifting her scarred hand to trace his jawline. "The music belongs to the world, but my heart belongs to you." The Duke of Westmoreland, the man who had once laughed at her ruined hands, dropped to one knee on the stage of the Crystal Palace. From his pocket he produced a ring not of diamonds, but of deep, forest-green emerald, perfectly matching her eyes. "Genevieve Cade," Gareth said, his voice carrying over the din of the applause, "will you do me the absolute honor of becoming my Duchess? Will you let me spend the rest of my life ensuring you never stop playing?" Genevieve looked down at him, her heart overflowing. She held out her left hand, the hand with the bent pinky, the thick scars, the hand of a survivor. "Yes," she whispered. Gareth slid the ring onto her scarred finger. It was a perfect fit. And as he kissed her hand one final time beneath the glass roof of the world's greatest exhibition, the Duke knew he was holding the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. From the deafening roar of the Spitalfields mills to the glittering stage of the Crystal Palace, Genevieve proved that true genius cannot be crushed. Gareth, the proud Duke, finally learned that the most beautiful music is born from the deepest scars. Did this defiant love story leave you breathless? If you were inspired by Genevieve's ultimate triumph, please hit the like button, share this extraordinary romance with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable historical dramas.